Hello and welcome to a Very Okay podcast. My name is Trey Thompson, and with me as always is Dr. Bob Blackburn. Bob, it's great to have you back this month for our podcast recording.
Thank you, Trey. And we survived a brutal August this year. Never got to 100. So anyway, it's good to be here, and it's good to be in Oklahoma.
Yeah, well, it's great to be talking with you again today. We have a fun topic today. I'm really excited about it. This idea was sent to me by a friend of mine, and we've kind of expanded upon it. It's going to be a little bit different than most of our podcasts, but the idea was to talk about exploring some of the history behind some of the interesting place names in Oklahoma. And as you'll talk about here in a second, Bob, there are lots of different influences in how things got their names in Oklahoma. And just doing a little bit of research, I found myself going down the rabbit hole really quickly. And so I'm excited to get into this conversation. And I'm also excited about our guests for today's podcast because we have two first-timers with us. First of all, we have Nicole Harvey, who is the director of the Oklahoma History Center Museum, which is the museum right here in the History Center in Oklahoma City. And so, Nicole, we are excited to have you with us today.
I am very excited to be here and disappointed I haven't been asked to do this podcast earlier.
Oh, boy. I'm in for it.
Nicole likes to have the last word.
Yeah. Believe me, Bob, I know. And with us also is Chantry Banks. Chantry is the director of museums and historic sites for the Oklahoma Historical Society.
And 24 or so wonderful sites all across the state. And I'm thrilled to be here as well. And I have nothing mean to say to either of you.
Well, in Trey, I've worked with both of these individuals before. Chantry, when he was director of Preservation Oklahoma, which is a very important support group for the Oklahoma Historical Society because we're limited in our advocacy in getting out there and getting groups. And POK has done a great job. I started with Ralph McCalmont, Susan Guthrie years ago. I remember Melvin and I sitting in the Journal Record building before the bombing. So this goes back early 90s, getting that started. And you came in, what, about 10 years ago, I would guess?
Let's see. About 6 years ago, 7 years ago. Yep.
But you kind of really brought it together with some professionalism and did real well around the state. And then, of course, worked with Nicole when I was with the Oklahoma Historical Society. She came in as my executive assistant and soon expanded her duties to a little bit of everything. So she was kind of our utility infielder. Put it that way. To use a baseball metaphor this time of year.
Well, you used to call me Radar O'Reilly.
You're right, yeah.
And I didn't know what that meant.
Oh, wrong generation. But Nicole would guess what I needed and knew what I needed before I actually said it. So that used to freak me out.
Nicole, how long have you been with the OHS?
I think 13 years. So I was Bob's assistant from 2012 and then basically till he retired. And then I took on the grant program.
Yep. And Director of Strategic Initiatives.
And then, Director of Strategic Initiatives. And now in my current role is Director of the Oklahoma History Center Museum.
And I don't know, she didn't really raise her hand for that job, but I kind of thrust her into it, and she's done a wonderful job. So
yeah.
We're very excited to have you in that role. But let's get into talking about some of these interesting topics. And when I was preparing for this, it reminded me of a great scene from, we like to talk about pop culture every now and then on this podcast, and it reminded me of a great scene from Wayne's World. And in that scene, Wayne and Garth go backstage to meet Alice Cooper, and they ask Alice Cooper, "Do you come to Milwaukee often?" And he sits down on the couch and he proceeds to give them a lecture and says, "Well, yes, but I'm not the only one who's come to Milwaukee often. French fur traders and missionaries have been coming here since the 1600s. And then somebody pipes in from the background and says, "Well, isn't Milwaukee an Indian word?" And he says, "Thank you for asking me that. Yes, it comes from the Algonquin word Milwaukee, which means the good land." And Wayne says, "Does this guy know how to party or what?" So we're not the first ones to jump on the bandwagon of figuring out where some of these great place names came from. And Nicole, you've got some interesting icebreaker facts about names, don't you?
I do. So I knew that there was a Blackburn, Oklahoma, and I started thinking, all right, is there a town name for each of the podcasters that will be present. So I did a little bit of a dive, and I found that, of course, we have Blackburn, which was named for Kentucky Senator Joseph C.S. Blackburn. It was incorporated in 1909. And then we have Thompsonville, which is a rural community in Creek County that was platted in 1922, named for J.W. Thompson. And then we have a defunct town called Harvey, which is in Lincoln County that doesn't exist anymore. Had a post office from 1891 to 1900, and it was named after Judge W.L. Harvey. And then I am so sorry, Chantry Banks. I was not able to. I thought Banks would be a for sure community, but
Yes.
I could not find one.
Okay.
At least I didn't see one in our handy George Shirk's Oklahoma Place Names book. But I did find two things that were somewhat close. I don't know if it's pronounced Shaney or Shanny, in Ellis County, which is defunct, and then Shant, which is was in Haskell County, and it's also defunct. So you and I are defunct.
But Nicole, if you feel shortchanged with places, you should know that there are many Harvey houses in Oklahoma that we still have, are still standing, going back to the days of Fred Harvey and the Harvey girls, and you're one of those.
And there's a street
You're a Harvey.
going through Oklahoma City called, with Harvey.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And Cheney County, was in Ellis County, Cheney, whichever it is. It's the first letter of 6 local families. I looked this up. Was the Carey, Hull, Adams, Nichols, Edmonds, and Yarnold families that created that name of Cheney in Ellis County.
See, friends, we know how to party too. That's good. Well, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about where some of the naming comes from and the background and some of that, and set the scene for us.
Well, partly because Oklahoma is such a young state and had such a long frontier era, we've had a variety of ways that names have been applied to a geographical place, to a town, to a crossroads, or whatever it might be. It really starts with American Indians. Of course, American Indians have been here at least 20,000 years. Some archaeologists think 30,000, who knows, but at least 20. And they had names for places because generally they were nomadic, they were hunter and gatherers. They needed to remember where you could find the best stuff to gather, where to get the best hunting, where to get fresh water. And so they would refer to places. And so American Indians had their own names, generally in their own language, that often was corrupted because the next group that would come in and use their names and sometimes amend them would have been the French. And the French really start coming into the territory after 1716, 1720. And of course, what they're coming for is not land and not even gold, as the Spanish had been, but they're coming to trade. And the way that they would work their way into the frontier was on rivers and up creeks. So they wanted to name the rivers. So they would ask the Indians, what's the name of this river? We'll meet you here next spring. We'll get your furs and we'll bring you trade goods. And it was commerce. And their motivation was to find American Indians willing to trade. So most of the major rivers in Oklahoma have French names. So you have River Rouge, the Red River. What the Indians called it, because the water comes through the red beds of the high plains, and it is red and salty by the time it gets here. But you also have the Canadian River, and then the North Canadian that flows through Oklahoma City, the Cimarron, the Poteau River, the Arkansas, and the Comanche. It goes on and on with the French names because they needed to know where to meet the Indians the next year. And so the French named a lot of our places. And then the U.S. Army would come in after 1803 as Indians were moved out of the colonial part of the country, and they were moved west. Military would say, hey, you've got to go out and keep the peace. You got to make peace among the Indians. Let's create safety so we can trade. Again, motivation is to make money. And as the Army came, largely they were naming their military facilities after other military men. And so you get Fort Gibson, named after an officer, Fort Towson, Fort Sill, Fort Reno. These are all names. One exception would have been Camp Supply, which was George Armstrong Custer's place where he was going to have supplies. after his winter campaign in 1868.
They weren't too creative on that one.
They weren't too creative, no. And of course, we have the town still of Fort Supply today. But the Army did a lot. And then the 5 tribes, as they came in, they named a lot of places because it was their land. They had fee title to it. A lot of times we think of all of Oklahoma was a reservation where the federal government said, hey, you use it for a while, we'll take it back anytime we want. Well, the 5 tribes actually bought their land and had fee title, and so they were naming their own towns. And when you expand to other tribes, like the Osage, they were naming their facilities based on their divisions. There were 3 big divisions of the Osage Nation by the time they come to Oklahoma in 1871. And so they're using names associated with their own clans and bands and applying that to, so you get a Fairfax and you get a Hominy, you get a Pahuska, named for white hair, is the way you actually said white hair in the Osage language, Pahuska. And so those names are coming down to us from the Indians. And then Wichita Mountains is a good example. The Wichita were encountered by Dragoon expedition, and they were camped in the Wichita Mountains, and so it became the Wichita Mountains.
Yeah.
It could have been the Kiowa Mountains, could have been Comanche Mountains, but the Kiowa or the Wichita were there. When artists were coming in, it became a popular place. And then after that, you really get the railroads would be the next big organization that had motivation to name it because they wanted to make money. Typically, railroads were making money in the American West by selling land. Well, in Oklahoma, they didn't get a lot of land. It was one of the few western states where railroads that would go in early would get land on either side of the railroad, they'd sell it, make a lot of money to immigrants, establish towns. Well, here, they didn't have all of that land, so they tried to have town sites. They were more motivated. So town sites like Edmond and Guthrie and Oklahoma City and Norman would all have been named by the railroads. Perry, it goes on and on. They were located on the railroad tracks, and the railroads were trying to make money out of it. Then after that, you get a wave of settlers who come in, and the settlers create a community because there's enough good farmland in a watershed area where once you get enough farmers to produce something, then you need a blacksmith, then you need a school teacher, then you need a post office. And so those settlers would name their towns. And so a lot of those towns are named after a local person who might have been the first settler. It could have been an important person or somebody that, like Veneta, even though that's Indian name, but named for Vinnie Reams, who was an actress on the stage at the time because some Cherokees really admired her. So Veneta, name came from her. But local settlers, people developing. And then we get a big wave of naming, especially counties are all named by the Constitutional Convention in 1906 and 1907. In fact, there was more time at the Constitutional Convention spent on counties, where the county seats would be, because this was going to be a big economic mover in the new state. And so naming them. So Rogers County, a lot of people think it's Will Rogers. It was his dad, Clem Rogers, who was one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah.
So a lot of them had things named for them. Alfalfa Bill Murray, had 2, Alfalfa County and Murray County. So they had a good time in naming. And then really last would be developers. And this is more common here in Oklahoma City, Nichols Hills, G.A. Nichols. Doc Nichols will put 2,000 acres under contract, brought in architects from Kansas City, created this entire new community with some retail, largely residential. And so developers have done a lot with names in the 20th century. And so really it's through all of these means. And then there are little things in between like post offices, and Nicole will talk about that. Sometimes there would be no name and they want to deliver with us. They just put a name on a place. And names have changed over the years.
Yeah.
So they've changed because of, the German hysteria of World War I. When you get towns like Berlin wanting to change their name because they thought that would draw, and there were some Germans, lynched and tarred and feathered. And a lot of the Ku Klux Klan effort of the 1920s came out of that anti-German and being against foreigners. But So our names have evolved for a variety of reasons, but that's kind of the big picture. And then within that fits these other stories that we'll get into some detail here.
Well, let's jump into it. Nicole, since Bob mentioned post offices and
hmm
you've done some research into postmasters and post offices, why don't you start us off?
Well, yeah. So I was flipping through George Shirk's book here that has all of these Oklahoma place names, and as Dr. Blackburn was mentioning, a lot of these communities are named after important people or postmasters. And I start noticing that I'm seeing a lot of names like Sophia or you know uh, Elizabeth or Anna, whatever last name, and then postmaster. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm guessing that these are postmistresses. And so I start looking and doing a little bit of a dive, and I find out that actually 10% of the postmasters in the United States in about 1890 were women. And I don't know why that surprised me. I don't know that it should, but I just did a little bit of a research into it, and it apparently the U.S. Postal Service was one of the first branches of federal government that was giving jobs to women. It was seen as somewhat socially acceptable because it was seen as a something you could do from your house or your husband's store, and it was seen as like a clerical or domestic type position. It was also a lot of times a political appointee, and so you have these women in our communities being postmasters, and then they're getting to name the town after them when they fill out that form and send it over to the post office. So to the officials in Washington D.C.
Did you find some examples of that?
I did. Back up your work, Nicole. Here we go. So I feel like we were in math class here for a second.
We're not just going to take your word for it.
No, you should. So now Weatherford, I don't know if it was named for the husband or the wife, but the first postmaster was a Lorinda Weatherford. And then we've got a couple of defunct towns. We've got Snyder, which was named after Margaret Snyder, who was the first postmaster. It was later changed to Nagel. And then we have Whitting, who was Ida Whitting, and then there was another town, Sophia. And a couple of them were defunct, but obviously towns like Weatherford still exist today.
Yeah.
And I was just really struck by the power of the post office in making these names. If a town submitted for a post office and they left it blank, it was at the discretion of the offices in Washington to give a name, or if there was a duplicate name, or there was some reason why that name shouldn't be taken in, they could just make it a change. And in the book, it actually notes that the gentleman, the Captain Tully, who was in this post at the time in the 1880s and for about 3 decades after that, a lot of towns across the United States are named after his family members or after his neighborhood, kids in the neighborhood, just because they had to think of names for some of these communities.
Chantry, you are our resident Western Oklahoma guy here at
Yes.
the OHS,
Yeah.
and you are from the bustling metropolis of Hammond, Oklahoma.
That is correct.
And then you researched some Western Oklahoma names. What do you have for us?
Well, just to piggyback on postmaster names, the town, it's not even a town, it's a community of Retrop, was named for the postmaster, Ira J. Porter. And so the legend growing up, or what I was told growing up, was that they changed it to Retrop, which is just Porter backwards, because the town of Porter already existed in Oklahoma. I don't know if that's true or if he was just being clever when he named named his little community of Retrop, but is there in Washita County, not far from, it's on your drive between Elk City and Granite. Which are two other interesting towns in Western Oklahoma. Granite being the most, I think, maybe one of the most obvious named communities in the entire state of Oklahoma, because it sits right at the foot of a giant granite hill, a mountain, headquarters mountain there in Greer County, there in the beginnings of the Wichita Mountains. And Elk City, which is the largest community in Beckham County, was originally called Bush when it was, it went by a couple of different names before statehood when it became Elk City, but it is named after Elk Creek now. which is there. The source of Elk Creek is right there in Elk City, and um, Captain Randolph Marcy is the one who named Elk Creek there because he saw elk tracks in the creek. But they're in good old Hammond, Oklahoma, my favorite place in the entire world, which sits at where Custer County and Roger Mills County meet. Hammond is named after not the postmaster or postmistress, but a gentleman named James Hammond. He was an agent for the Red Moon Agency, which was a sub-agency of the Cheyenne Arapaho Agency, which was headquartered at Darlington. So Hammond exists because of the Red Moon Agency. Once they started building the Red Moon Agency, Mr. Hammond was sent out there. He was a farmer. He was sent out there to teach the Cheyenne Arapaho children how to farm. And so Red Moon School was also based there. And the farm I grew up on was just a couple miles from the Red Moon Agency. And so settlers saw the opportunity to begin settling around the Red Moon Agency, around the school there for trade. And that's how Hammond came to be. And Mr. Hammond's wife, Ida, was the first postmaster there at Hammond. And so Roger Mills County, also, it was named after Roger Q. Mills, who was a Confederate officer in the Civil War and later a Texas senator. Its county seat is Cheyenne, obviously named for the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes that call that part of the country, that part of the state, home. And then right next door is Custer County, which was named for General George Armstrong Custer, with its county seat of Arapaho. So
whenever you talk about Hammond, I can't help but think of one of my heroes in Oklahoma history of all time. When I wrote the Centennial Book of the state in 2007, I ended the book with this story of Lawrence Hart, whose grandparents would have settled in that Red Moon community, some of the more conservative of all the Cheyenne in the Cheyenne Nation stayed that far west. They didn't want to be near Darlington. They wanted to be up, farther away from the corruption of that, white society. And but Lawrence Hart would have gone to Red Moon and became a peace chief there.
Yep. Same with White Shield Creek, which runs there through the town of Hammond, named after Chief White Shield as well.
Well, and since you mentioned towns that their names are pretty obvious why they were named that, because of towns like Granite, reminds me of the town of Marble City in eastern Oklahoma, and it's because there's a giant marble quarry there. So,
Cement, Oklahoma.
Right. Sulfur. Yes.
so sometimes you don't have to really kind of stretch the imagination to name a town. You just look at what's around you and say, well, this is the name.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the name Noble pops up several times in the former unassigned lands, which became Oklahoma Territory. There's the city of Noble, there is Noble County, and in several towns you also see a Noble Street. And so why did this name pop up so often? Well, as it turns out, this county streets, they were named for the Secretary of the Interior, John W. Noble, who served under President Benjamin Harrison from 1889 to 1893. I wrote 1983 in my notes, and that is not right. He would have served in there a long, long time. But he was born in 1831 in Lancaster, Ohio. He ended up graduating from Yale in 1851, and he was admitted to the bar in Ohio in 1853, moved to St. Louis, and then during the Civil War, he served in the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then became the Judge Advocate General of the Army of the Southwest. He ended his service in the war as a brigadier general. He went back to Missouri, where he was appointed the U.S. District Attorney for the Eastern District in 1867, and he was tapped to be the Secretary of the Interior by President Harrison. Now, why do we see so many towns and things named for Noble? Well, the land runs and the assignment of lands during that time from 1889 to 1893, it was the Interior Department who oversaw all of the nitty-gritty details of making that happen. So the Interior Department was responsible for setting the rules and regulations for the land run, including the dates, the geographical areas, any procedures for claiming land, and they were also to establish the location of the land offices. I read a funny story in the Chronicles as I was doing my research on this. He really didn't have much information on the topography of Oklahoma, so the first place that he chose to be the location of the Kingfisher land office was actually in a ravine, and he ended up having to move it around a little bit. He would also settle legal disputes for land claims. So in today's day and age, when we talk about the Secretary of the Interior, we mostly see someone, of course, who's in charge of a massive department in the national parks and the Indian Affairs, but they are in a lot of ways a figurehead. They don't do a lot of the nitty gritty work. Well, back in these days, he would have been very involved in all of the affairs to the point of actually settling land disputes too. And I found this case of a man named Ransom Payne, who was a deputy marshal in the unassigned lands. And at the moment the gun goes off at noon on April the 22nd, 1889, he just goes a little bit north of Guthrie and he claims his 160-acre plot of land. And of course, another person who fairly participated in a land run claimed that same spot of land. And the big dispute was, well, he was here before, he wasn't technically a Sooner because he was in the unassigned lands legally, but he had an advantage. And this was a case that ultimately came to Noble, and he wrote, "Parties who occupied positions similar to that occupied by Payne had abundant opportunity to qualify themselves as claimants by withdrawing from the territory and placing themselves on par with others had they so desired. This Payne declined to do, but sought to take advantage of his position to anticipate the arrival of any other claimants from the point they had occupied in obedience of the law." So basically what Noble is saying here is he had an unfair advantage. Well, this works its way all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898 ultimately sides with Noble and his interpretation of law, and Payne was forced to give up his claims. But at one point, it was estimated as many of a third of the claimants during the 1889 land run were probably fraudulent by Sooners and people who took advantage. And it was a giant mess, to say the least, Bob. And but this is the kind of work. He was deeply involved in all of the details of the land runs and the land lotteries for all of that time during his tenure as Secretary of the Interior. In 1902, at the 13th anniversary of the land run, he gave a keynote address here in Oklahoma, and he said, "On the 22nd day of April, 1889, at noon that day on time, the bugle and the cannon sounded 'Forward, Oklahoma,' and the echoes are yet in our soul. And today we have come to celebrate it because it has proved to be one of the signal events for good in American history." I think people might disagree with that today. Of course, we look at history with a little bit more nuance too. But Noble came back many times to Oklahoma. He also supported the statehood for Oklahoma Territory and would come back and speak at those events and conventions as well. So that's who these places named Noble are named for, John W. Noble. And he died in St. Louis in 1912.
Well, we're talking about the land runs. The town comes to my mind on the southern edge of the unassigned lands, the little town of Purcell.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't think much about, what happened to Purcell. But Robert Jeremiah Love was a Chickasaw who was orphaned during the Civil War. And both of his parents were killed during the war. He survived, became a cowboy. By 1870s, he had a couple of horses and a small herd of cattle, but just getting by, largely in the western part of the Chickasaw Nation. But then he became friends with cattlemen out of North Texas in Gainesville, and when the Santa Fe Railroad started building through in 1885, he was selling beef to the construction crews. And, of course, those guys needed about 8,000 calories a day on the railroad, so he was getting beef. He was getting beef from other Chickasaws, doing real well. Well, he became so ingrained with the Santa Fe people that he found out where the North crew and the South crew were going to meet somewhere in the middle, kind of like driving the Golden Spike on the Transcontinental Railroad. he found out it was going to be just south of the South Canadian River in the unassigned lands. And so he went forward, and as a Chickasaw could claim a town site and named it Purcell. And so didn't do real well at first because not many people wanted to live that far on the frontier. But when he made it, land run of 1889, because it became the southern port for everything coming into the unassigned lands and everything going out towards the south. And until the Frisco Railroad is built in 1897, almost all of our commerce went south. So all of our cotton was going to Galveston and Houston. Everything went down river largely to New Orleans. So that southern route and having Purcell. And then some people might, especially from central Oklahoma, would know that there was a famous merchant who started his business in Purcell in 1892, B.C. Clark.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. You beat me to it.
To beat you to it. But anyway, little town of Purcell has that interesting history behind it. And Robert Jeremiah Love's great-grandson would start his own string of businesses in 1963 and 4, and that was Tom Love, Love's Country Stores and Travel Stops. So that one family has had a lot to do with changing place names around the state.
Yeah, without B.C. Clark, we wouldn't know when Christmas starts, right?
Good, please.
So say Chantry and I will come back in December and do a rendition for you.
And the first Loves was in Watonga. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yep. Which also was home at one time to a restaurant called the Noble House.
So
So
there we go.
the best cheese soup you'll ever have.
There we go. And with that, we're going to take a quick break.
Got a sweet tooth and a love for history? Then mark your calendars for the Cinnamon Roll Social at Fort Towson Historic Site. On Saturday, September 27th from 10 a.m. to noon, enjoy fresh, hot cinnamon rolls straight from a Dutch oven. While you snack, wander through the museum and stroll the fort's scenic grounds where soldiers once lived, worked, and built their community. It's free, it's fun, and it's a chance to connect with neighbors, community leaders, and the Oklahoma Historical Society team. Don't miss this cozy mix of history, conversation, and of course, cinnamon rolls. So grab your friends and step into history with a side of sugar. The Cinnamon Roll Social, September 27th at Fort Towson.
And we're back. Okay, Nicole, you've got some funny names in Oklahoma you want to talk to us about.
Oh,
She's a funny girl.
well,
I'd say.
I am. Just call me Barbara. You get it? You get it, Chantry? Barbara Streisand? Yeah.
Of course.
Not Barbara, but
Barbara. Yeah.
Uh, okay. So I think a lot of people have heard of this one, or maybe not. I don't know. But Slap Out in Beaver County, which apparently, I don't know if this is true or not, but the legend says that the storekeeper was always slap out of whatever it is that you needed from his store. And so the name stuck.
Well, as we know from the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So we'll go with that.
And that's all I've ever heard. That's the only.
That's the one.
Yes, that's the only explanation I've ever heard.
You've also got Frogville, which is somewhat self-explanatory, but apparently it has swarms of, which I've never heard the term swarms of frogs, but that's what my notes say. Swarms of frogs, and this is in quotes here, so large they ate young ducks.
Wow, that's straight
That's
out
a
of
big
Genesis.
frog.
That's-
It is a real big
A
frog.
plague of, yeah.
So this one's not funny. This one's just kind of cute. The town of Henrietta was named after a couple named Henry Beard and his wife Etta Ray Beard. So you take Henry and Etta and make Henrietta, which I thought was kind of sweet. We have, it's October now, or we're coming into October, I should say, Pumpkin Center.
Hmm.
But I don't know anything about it other than it's called Pumpkin Center, and it sounded fall-esque, and it sounded fun to me. It's also like I can't remember if it's Cookieville or Cookie Town, but there's a cookie something. We had a really great post on our social media for the agency in which it kind of was using like all of the terms of all the different places we've got in our state that would make up a meal, and then get foil to wrap your leftovers. I mean, just kind of cute little puns and that was one of the ones that was listed. Pumpkin Center was on that. And then last we've got antlers. And this is, again, not funny, but it's just antlers apparently were just nailed to a tree to mark a stream crossing. And that was what the name took the town took its name after. And again, a postmistress, Ella Colbert, was the first postmaster there.
Very nice. Very nice. Bob, you have any other names you want to talk to us about?
Yeah. I wanted to mention that within cities, you have place names. People know, a certain part of town by a name. And two examples would be one in Tulsa. And the Arkansas River, of course, flows through Tulsa. Everyone knows. Well, in the 1970s, the idea is create some low water dams and create more of a lake. And then around the lake, we'll have trails, and then we'll have statuary, and lots of things were happening in Tulsa. And it really helped Tulsa's economic development downtown along the Riverwalk, is what we still call it. But the name given to the lake was Zinc Lake, Zink. And it was not from the mineral zinc, but it was from Jack and John Zink. John Zink had studied mechanical engineering at OU, worked for Oklahoma Natural Gas, 1931, went out on his own, started developing new kinds of burners and floor furnaces and different apparatus for industrials. And then along comes Jack, his son, after World War II, expands it into an international company. And between Jack and John, there were two different foundations that put up the initial money to come in with the low water dams. And so you get Zinc Lake.
Okay.
And here in Oklahoma City, a good example is that the old industrial section of town on the northeast side of town, which would have been east of the Santa Fe tracks, south of the Frisco and Rock Island tracks, and north of the river, which cut through. So it created a triangle. That was an industrial district. No one wanted to have homes there if they could help it, and became an area with 2 and 3, sometimes 4-story brick buildings. Well, fast forward to World War II and coming out of World War II with industrial districts and trucks that couldn't get into these old industrial parts of Oklahoma City as well as Tulsa. And so you get the industrial districts. Well, companies start leaving that area of Oklahoma City, and it becomes kind of a wasteland with literally grass growing up. I took a photograph in 1978 in this part of Oklahoma City, and grass was literally growing up between the brick. There was not enough cars to keep the grass from growing in the bricks. And so literally it was grass growing up in the bricks. Well, a developer who got interested in historic preservation very early, Neil Horton, who had developed the oil and gas building right by the First National Bank building today. He got excited about historic preservation in the 70s when it was a big deal, really starting with Congress in 66 and coming to Oklahoma. Well, Neil Horton looked at that and he said, this looks like an asset to me, and maybe it's something that I can develop. So he put together a development company, hired a young architect named Don Beck, who had later designed the Oklahoma History Center, hired a young PhD student from OSU who was willing to scramble and work, named Bob Blackburn. I put 10 buildings.
Who's that guy?
Yeah.
Never came of him.
Put 10 buildings on the National Register. Don put together a concept, and they called it Bricktown. Well, Bricktown didn't come from the city council saying it's going to be Bricktown. It didn't come from it, but it came from this developer who had this idea. And just like Zinc Lake and Tulsa, Bricktown here, you get different names applied to geographical areas that we know today. And so I think those are two urban stories that kind of you can trace back to individuals making decisions.
Fascinating. Chantry, I was wondering, you had mentioned when we were getting prepared for this, you did a little research on the name behind the Washita River.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about the Washita River.
I would love to. I grew up on a big bend in the Washita River at the confluence of Quartermaster Creek and the Washita River. Washita is, so it's Washita, is the well, not even the European, it's not the French, it's the English pronunciation or spelling of two Choctaw words, Owa Cheetah, which means big hunt. And so we have two separate spellings of Washita in the state of Oklahoma. Of course, the Washita National Forest, the mountains in southeast Oklahoma, but then the Washita River, which begins in the Texas Panhandle and is a tributary of the Red River and runs its way down through northwest Oklahoma, central western Oklahoma, into central Oklahoma, and dumps there into the Lake Texoma now. But there where I grew up on the Washita with the Quartermaster Creek was named for James Bell, who was a quartermaster for Custer at the battle or massacre of the Washita in 1868. It was this area where these two bodies of water meet was the short-lived home of the Cheyenne Arapaho Cattle Company. Just lasted a few years. It was I believe, a 1 million acre cattle operation, and a beautiful Oklahoma Historical Society marker marks that there on the highway just south of the of that area. But the Washita where I grew up, so as you're driving down I-35, you drive over the Washita a couple of different times, and it looks like a beautiful big well hydrated river, very nicely flowing river. But up where I am, sometimes there's no water in it at all. The last time I drove over the bridge that I grew up playing under, dangerously, there was not a drop of water in the river. But that's changed in this very wet and mild year that we've had. So yeah, that's what I've learned about the Washita. And of course, Battle of the Washita happened there on the Washita River, just west of Cheyenne, Oklahoma.
It is really interesting because if you go to that site of where that massacre took place, and just a little plug, we did a podcast about that battle or massacre of the Washita a couple of years ago, so you can go and listen to that. But you can almost jump over the river right there. It's not very wide.
It's we'd call it a creek or a creek right there, where they're at Cheyenne, and especially even just a little further north and west. One of my favorite places to visit is the Metcalf Museum and Break-A-Day Farm there near Durham, Oklahoma, and it's barely you could spit and add quite a bit of water to the flow of it right there. So it is a major tributary of the Red River. It just picks up a lot of springs and creeks on its journey.
Yeah, we did our podcast over the 1834 Dodge Leavenworth expedition a couple of episodes ago. And, one of the places they camped was where the Washita meets the Red River as they're working their way to go west to the Wichita Mountains. And I got on a little lark and I pulled up Google Maps, and then I zoomed in and I just started tracing the Washita. First of all, it is not a straight river at all. It twists and curves and bends, but I trace it. I mean, it covers a lot of territory in Oklahoma, and you're exactly right. When you're driving west on I-40, you're driving west on any of the major towns, you'll cross the Washita several times, and you just think to yourself, like, where does this river go? And just like you said, there are places where it's not very wide, and then there are places where it's, good wide and it's flowing really well.
Right, and it has those beautiful, at some very steep red cliffs that make up the banks of the Washita, to the fact that my grandparents really believed that there on the farm there's a huge bluff that falls right into the Washita, and they had found a few bison remnants at this site. So they believe we had a bison kill site there on the Washita there in Custer County. And I could talk about the Washita all day, but it also was just so notoriously known for flooding almost every spring, to the point that the Upper Washita Conservation District was one of the first conservation districts created in the country to create a series of ponds and dams to help with flood control there in Roger Mills and Custer County.
Because of the flooding, some of the best farmland in the state around Halls Valley, Chickasha. If you meander up the Ouachita River, you're going to see some of the richest farmland in Oklahoma.
And I have spent many an hour following, like you, Google Maps just to follow that route of the river, because there's several little oxbow lakes that have been created over the decades too for that river.
Nobody can tell us we don't know how to have a good time, Chantry. Well, I want to take us to the opposite end of the state, in the far southeastern corner of Oklahoma in McCurtain County, and I want to talk about Beavers Bend State Park. And when I was doing research online, most of the sources that I looked at about Beavers Bend State Park said it was named for John T. Beavers, or you'll see him referred to as Johnny Beavers, a Choctaw citizen who married Lavina Hudson Beavers, who was a full-blood Choctaw, and her father had also been the chief of the Choctaw Nation. And in 1930, the land that they lived on in southeast Oklahoma, it was sold to the Choctaw Lumber Company. And then that company ended up selling it to local community leaders, and it became ultimately ended up becoming one of Oklahoma's original state parks. Also a podcast episode that we've done here, Beavers Bend State Park. And what's interesting about this, and I called our resident McCurtain County historian. Actually, I didn't call, I texted him, because I've started seeing some information that maybe Beavers Bend wasn't named for Johnny Beavers and the Beavers family. Maybe it was actually named because there were beavers there. And so I texted our Kenny Seivert, our OHS board member who knows everything there is to know about Choctaw, about southeastern Oklahoma, and in particular McCurtain County. And I said, hey, can you give me the straight scoop on this? And he said, yeah. He said, John's wife, Lavina, gave an interview to the WPA in 1938, and she said that it was called Beavers Bend long before Johnny Beavers. Johnny Beavers was born in Alabama and made his way into the Choctaw Nation in the 1890s. And she said it was called that long before because there was actually, before it was all trapped out, there were a lot of beavers in that area. And she did an interview in the Indian Pioneer papers that we have here in our collection at the Oklahoma Historical Society. So this morning, I asked Chad Williams if he could help me pull that up, and I actually read her interview, and in it she said, Indians call this place Bokfolta in Choctaw, which is winding around river in English. But white people call it Beavers Bend because there were many beaver in this river in those early days. And so she kind of sets the record straight that it was called Beavers Bend before Johnny Beavers got there. Now, I did also look on the Gateway to Oklahoma History and looked up John Beavers' name just to see if there were any mentions of him in the newspaper. And boy, am I glad I did, because I found a couple of great quotes about John Beavers in the newspaper. So Ida Bell's Democrat Record newspaper on November 9th, 1911 notes that John T. Beavers was here from Eagletown Monday. John says that while he had killed every kind of animal in the woods, he likes to look at the big cats that grow in other countries. He claims, and can no doubt verify the claim, which I would really love to see how you do that, but he claims that he has killed more deer than any man in Oklahoma or Arkansas. So interesting. And then in February 7th of 1912, the McCurtain County Gazette announced John Beavers' run for county commissioner. And in the quote, it said, John Beavers is perhaps one of the most widely known men in the county, having a hunting record from Maine to Mexico. He intends to make you a commissioner of which you will dream about in after years. And he says he knows the needs of McCurtain County and will, quote, take no monkey business if he is commissioner. So he looks like he was a man who was not to be trifled with, and you probably he could probably have many different ways to kill you if he wanted to. But
Did he win?
I suspect not, because he was running as a Republican, and he was probably the only Republican in McCurtain County in 1912. He ended up dying in 1936 at the age of 86, but his wife Lavina lived on until 1955. So, despite what you find online, it seems that Beaver's Bend State Park is really named for the, at one time, abundance of beavers. I'm sure that has a lot of, I don't think they trap it anymore. So maybe the beaver population has come back. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Mhm.
Nicole, what do you got for us? What's some other fun and interesting things you have for us?
So, I noticed there were some repeat names, and by repeat names, I mean names from other states or other places in the world that found their way to Oklahoma. One of the most obvious examples that a lot of us will know is Prague, Oklahoma. And, I struggle when I am talking about Prague to properly pronounce it now, just like Miami, Florida, you want to say, Miami. But yeah, pra-
Prague.
Mhm.
now I'm gonna get
She
myself.
twisted her tongue again.
Prague, Oklahoma, was named after Prague at the time, Czechoslovakia. And we've got two Muskogee Creek names of Eufaula and not quite Tulsa, but it was a creek or Muskogee word called Tallahassee, I think is maybe
Mhm.
pronouncing that correctly, and it was meaning Old Town. And these were two locations in Alabama. And Eufaula, the book I was reading actually didn't go into this detail, but I did a little bit of research and saw that Eufaula was a tribe that was under the Muskogee Creek Confederation. And of course, these names came with them as they made their way during removal to Indian Territory. And you've got some more, some other ones like Dover. Originally, I think Dover, Delaware, and then it comes to Dover, England, and then you've got Lebanon, which uh, comes from Lebanon, Tennessee. And then I looked at Lebanon, Tennessee's origin, and it was for the cedar trees in Lebanon, Tennessee, which I guess have there's a biblical
Cedars of Lebanon. Yeah.
thank you trait. And so that came, and there was the headquarters of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And then lastly is Kildare, which again most likely named after County Kildare in Ireland. So you've got a lot of people bringing their place names, their culture with them as they're coming into Oklahoma.
Bob, one that's been lost to time that I can't figure out who it was named for is Gene Autry.
Mm.
It's Roy Rogers.
That's what I thought, but I wanted
I
to.
guess we're sure. A name that I grew up with that I didn't know anything about for years here in Oklahoma City, Tinker Air Force Base.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's the largest employer in the state. Tinker Air Force Base we've known since, World War II is important. My dad was in the Army Air Corps, so that was of interest to me. But when it was first established, before we entered the war, actually European war was going, and America was arming, and they needed a depot somewhere in the Midwest for the Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force at the time, but it was part of the Army. And they decided to come to Oklahoma City, and it was called Midwest Air Depot originally. So Midwest City comes from Midwest Air Depot.
I honestly did not know that. That's news to me.
Yeah, so that was it. When Bill Atkinson established the town, he took the name after the base. Well, in 1942, there was a major general with the Air Force named Clarence Teeker, who was Osage. And Clarence had joined the Army during the Philippine insurrection, served in the Army, later became a pilot, learned to fly at at Fort Silk, which was the center for aviation with the Army Air Corps at the time, and was a real advocate for aviation in the interwar period. When the war began, they put him in charge of the air base in Honolulu that had been destroyed by the Japanese. And he was a very aggressive warrior, typical of Osage traditions. And like Lawrence Hart, a good example of that, became a Marine, Air Force jet fighter pilot. the warrior tradition would live among American Indians, and generally American Indian tribes over the years have volunteered for service in the military in greater numbers than any other part of our society. But Clarence Tinker was one of those warriors, very aggressive, and out of Hawaii, he planned several missions to bomb Midway, another Japanese outpost. And on one of those raids, a plane went down and killed him. And so in his honor, an Osage Indian from Osage County, they named Tinker Air Force Base, renamed it from Midwest to Tinker. And so that's the name that we know now, and we need to honor Clarence Tinker as not only a great war hero, but an Osage Indian and someone who was willing to serve his country.
That's great. That's great. That's a good story. I knew some of that, but not all of that. So that's good. Chantry, do you have any others to share with us?
Well, I wanted to ask Dr. Blackburn to clarify what I grew up hearing about the community of Berlin, Oklahoma. Is it true that it was originally called Berlin until this wave of anti-German hate rose in the state or in the country?
I think you're right.
Okay. Because there's also in Roger Mills County, that's in Roger Mills County, there's also Hamburg in Roger Mills County, a little community there. So I don't know if it was, originally called Hamburg until we decided we had to change the pronunciation of things.
Well, we know that German settlements Germans did migrate to Northwest Oklahoma for the farming, and we know that they established communities out there as well. So it stands to reason.
Yeah. I was wondering if, there are certain towns pronunciations in this state that you are an Okie or you're not an Okie if you can't pronounce the town correctly. And I was wondering if you had any that come to mind immediately.
Durant.
Okay.
Miami.
Trait.
Well, one of my favorites that you hear mispronounced a lot is Tahlequah. Because if you hear someone that is pronouncing it and they're from out of state, sometimes on the news or what, you hear Tahlequah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, a very famous, a more recent example of that is that first season of Only Murders in the Building, where Tina Fey's character mispronounces Chickasha.
And they had to go back
and they had to correct it in season 2. For me, it's Visai. People say Vicky all the time, or Vici, which is that's actually the the town was named after Veni Vidi Vici, the Latin term there. So it says in jest in Mr. Shirk's book. It does say in jest. So maybe nobody was conquering anything there in Visai, Oklahoma. But
I have a friend who grew up here, but her parents did not, and she thought that Miami, Oklahoma was supposed to be pronounced Miami, but that Gary England just had a very thick Oklahoma accent. And I had to explain to her that no, it is actually Miami.
He was a good Sealing boy.
Yep.
One little quick pop culture reference here. You remind me of that, Chantry. My mother had a television show, and she was interviewing Bob Hope one day on the show. And Bob Hope kind of turned around the interview. He said, "Well, Ida, where were you born?" Because of her accent. And she said, "Ninnekah." And he says, "Ninnekah? Where's that?" She said, "Oh, about 8 miles from Eguam." And Bob Hope says, "Ida, that's funny. That's a good job."
Oh, man.
We could do a whole podcast on funny stories of Ida B.
Yeah.
Well, I'll close us out here with a story about the name behind the city of Langston and Langston University. And Langston was actually named for John Mercer Langston. And I realized that I've talked about 3 gentlemen named John here today, and I did not do that on purpose. I kind of picked these towns randomly, and they were all named for someone named John. Of course, Beaver's Bend wasn't a town. But John Mercer Langston was born free on a plantation in Virginia in 1829. He was the son of a woman, Lucy Langston, who had been enslaved but had since been freed. And then his father was a white man, Captain Ralph Quarries, who had been her former enslaver. He's actually sent to Ohio to be raised by a close friend of John Quarles. and he attended Oberlin College and studied law. In 1854, he became the first African American to pass the bar in Ohio. And he made an important speech at the American Anti-Slavery Convention in 1855. And this is a quote from the speech, and I really like this quote. "There is not within the length and breadth of this entire country, from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, a solitary man or woman who is in possession of his or her full share of civil, religious, and political liberty. We have been in the habit of boasting of our Declaration of Independence, our federal Constitution, and the Ordinance of 1787, and yet I am forced to declare, looking the truth directly in the face and seeing the power of American slavery, that there is not within the bosom of this entire country a solitary man or woman who can say, 'I have my full share of liberty.'" He was a passionate advocate for civil rights and equal rights for Black Americans. He helped found the National Equal Rights League with Frederick Douglass in 1864. In 1867, he was selected to be the Inspector General of the Freedmen's Bureau, and then he later went on to become law professor at Howard University in 1869 and was then made the dean of the law school in 1870. He ran for Congress as a Republican from Virginia in 1888, and the results of the election were disputed. Finally, in 1890, the House of Representatives settled the dispute and brought him in, and then he lost his reelection bid, and he died in 1897 at the age of 68 years old. But that is who Langston University and the city of Langston are named for, just north of here where we are in Oklahoma City.
Real hero.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I've had the best time learning about some of these place names, and thank you, Chantry, and thank you, Nicole, for going on this little lark with us. This is definitely a different kind of podcast than we've done before, but I had a lot of fun with it.
That was
We could have gone all day, I'm afraid. I had,
Oh,
yeah.
I had more to talk about, so I think we may have to revisit this topic sometime in the future. What do you say, Bob?
let's do it.
Okay, well, with that, we will look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks and have a great day.